G'day legends, I hope you're all fantastic. On today's video, we're going to have a little bit of fun and compare the JCM800 2203 model on 4 different hardware modelers. I've got the new Fender ToneMaster Pro, I've got the Line 6 HX Stomp with the latest firmware, the Neural DSP Quad Cortex, and then my AXFX3, which is mounted in my rack on the latest firmware. All of these have some variation of a classic JCM800 2203 with various names, you know, Brit 800, 800 Brit, 2203, Brit 800 2203. It's fairly obvious what they are all modeling. So what I wanted to do was play the same DI through each of these units with just the amp block. I'm using the same cabinet IR and the same end of chain signal on all of this. I've normalized the audio levels. I've crossfaded everything so there should be no clicks or pops while you're listening. And I just want you to have a listen to the similarities and the differences between these 4 different hardware modelers. I won't tell you which clip is which. Let's go. Now that's a single riff with particular settings dialed in. Before we talk about the similarities and differences, I will just mention that I did go into quite a bit of depth in terms of comparing the overall frequency response of these. So I did run some noise through each of these and use a spectrometer so that I could look at the overall frequency response and basically dial them in as close as possible. So I didn't just go to every amp model and set everything at noon. What I did was I got my core tone happening, and then I used that as a reference for all the others. And you would have heard clip A, B, and C sounded very, very similar to one another. You can probably hear some differences if you're listening on studio monitors or with headphones, but again, if you're just kind of sitting on the can listening on your phone, you may not even notice that they are changing if I wasn't telling you that they were changing. But D definitely sounds a little bit different in there. It was really, really hard to get that one dialed in like the others. There was always a little bit too much of this kind of weird low end happening, and I just couldn't get enough of that signature JCM800 brightness out of it. It was like a little bit dark sounding as well. So having said that, let's reveal what each of the clips were. So you can see in there between the AXFX3, the Quad Cortex, and the HX Stomp, the settings are actually pretty similar to one another. I was really surprised at how close the Quad Cortex and the AXFX were at basically the stock settings. I just had to bump the presence control on the Quad Cortex up a little bit to get that extreme high end sounding similar. And then the 2203 on the Helix, I just kind of had to run everything around 6 or 7-ish rather than running them at noon on there. And you would have noticed on the Axe that I had the master volume at 4 and the presence at 4, basically just the stock settings on there, which I think sound really, really good. The ToneMaster Pro though was like I was saying earlier, a lot harder to get dialed in. And the settings that I used were pretty extreme, having the treble cranked up all the way, having to pull out most of the mid-range, in fact, all of the mid-range and most of the bass on there. So what I'm gonna do is just let that DI run through it, and I'll just twist some of the knobs on there, and you'll see that I didn't really have that much room to maneuver with that particular model on there. It's just kind of got a core sound, and the EQ doesn't really do that much aside from the treble control, which really does kind of sweep between being a lot darker and a lot brighter. But even then, I couldn't get the same brightness out of it that I could with the other models. Another good test of a good JCM800 style sound is how it cleans up. JCM800s with the gain control kind of lower are known for being quite shrill and bright because of the presence of a bright cap on there. That's one thing that a lot of people complained about with the 2204 model on the Helix up until the latest firmware where they added the 2203. The 2204, the amp they modeled didn't have a bright cap in there, whereas the 2203 does, and it's kind of got that signature snarl about it. One thing when you do have a bright cap on your gain control is it's going to clean up in a very particular way. And when you take your guitar volume control down, you should get this really nice kind of sparkly clean sound. So what I want to do now is roll my guitar volume down. I'm going to do the same DI. This is with the volume on my DGT at around 6. I'll just play some open chords and you'll hear it through each of these modelers. In conclusion, we are really splitting hairs between the Quad Cortex, the Helix, and the Fractal. You can get some fantastic 800 tones out of all of those on there, and I think if I had to gig with any of those and get some classic Marshall tones, I would not complain about any of them. They do offer different levels of customization on there. Obviously, the Fractal being considerably deeper, where you can play around with things like the speaker impedance curves, the amount of negative feedback, lots of other stuff. You can basically go in there and mod that to your heart's delight. If that's something that you want to do, it's awesome. If it's something that you're not interested in, it's also awesome as well. You don't have to do that. I'm not trying to sit here and say that one of these units is necessarily better or worse than the others based on like a single riff played through a single amp on here. But I did see the Sonic Drive studio video comparing the EVH models in the Tone Master Pro and these platforms as well. It's what inspired me to do this video. Shout out to John. I love your videos, John. But he did that video and basically Fender turned around and said, oh yeah, there's a bug with the red channel in that model. So I'm curious to know, Fender, is there a bug with this JCM800 and the way it is modeled? I've read some things over on the gear page where they were talking about the way the speaker impedance curve modeling is implemented on this particular unit, where basically it is in the cab block, which I don't think is very ideal because that impedance should be in the amp block where you've got all the dynamic stuff happening, because if you've got amps with, say, varying levels of negative feedback, they are going to interact with that speaker impedance in a very dynamic way. So I'd be really, really curious to see if Fender A, watch this, and B, are going to set out to kind of fix some of the perceived issues with these models in here. The really extreme settings that I had to go to on this model, and then the overall kind of darkness and saturation maybe make me think that there's either a bug or the amp that they've modeled, kind of like the previous Helix model, doesn't have a bright cap in there, or that there's just something else going on. But for now, I'd love to know your thoughts on this comparison, and I'd love to know what your favorite Michael Schenker Group song is as well, so that I can go and learn a different riff for future comparisons. If you like what I'm doing here on the channel, check the video description for various ways to support me. Have a great day, be good to one another, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.